The last part we're going to talk about is this idea of risk and the economic management of the global economy. So, with the global shift, businesses are relocating their factories, their stores, their shops all around the world. But one thing that they have to consider is risk. If you build a factory in Vietnam and the country changes its laws and now mandates that everyone gets paid health insurance, it's going to make that much more expensive. Or if you build a factory in a small village in Africa, but the country descends into civil war and people can't come to work or die, or your factory is burned to the ground, right? That's a risk. So large companies have to measure this. They're actually measuring vulnerability, but not the vulnerability to crisis that we talked about, not about hurricanes or tornadoes. They're looking at man made factors, political instability, example. It's not very inviting to build a factory in a country where the government is not very stable, where there's a lot of crime, where there's a risk there might be a revolution, right? So, how do you measure that? One of the things they use are various social measures. So, they look at things like infant mortality. So, infant mortality, if you're not quite sure, this is just a measurement. How many children in a population die before the age of 5? And why is that important? Well, if you have a large number of children dying young, that actually tells you a lot of things about the country. It tells you things like corruption or regime type. One of the reasons that children die young is lack of access to clean drinking water. And oftentimes in countries where there are corrupt governments or there's a lot of issues with the government, they don't have the ability to maintain a water system that is healthy. So the water is not clean. Or conversely, the sewer system doesn't work. It takes a lot of money to maintain sewers. So that's an indication. You can see that. Another thing that would cause high childhood mortality is lack of access to medical care. And so if you have a lack of access to medical care, that can also be indicative of things like a corrupt government, a lot of corruption or crime in the streets. It could also be indicative of things like internal conflict. If there is a civil war going on, if there's fighting in the streets, people aren't going to have the time to go to the doctor. They're going to be worrying for their lives, or they're not going to have time to maintain the sewers. So those things often are reflective in things like infant mortality or average lifespan or educational attainment. Okay. Now, this idea of being not vulnerable, this is vital. People are not going to move their money. Capital mobility, the ability to move your factories from Detroit to Mexico or to China, right? People that have the money, the global investors, and the trade that goes with them need to measure this. Otherwise, they could build a factory and lose all their money. So, up until the 1970s, we did not see a lot of investment in China because the laws were such that all factories in China must be owned by the government, and foreign countries could not be involved at all. And this was a reflection of their past exploitation by colonial empires, but it also eliminated any type of involvement with the Western economy. In the 1970s, China changed that and they allowed foreign investment. They still did not let them completely own factories, but they were allowed to build a little bit, and China leveraged that to grow their economy. This map just shows you, excuse me, different types of states based on this idea of fragility. A fragile state is one like Syria or Somalia or Sudan, where there is so much conflict and tension and civil war going on that it's basically a country in name only. In Somalia, there really isn't a national government. It's whatever gang controls that area of the country, and they are the government in that area of the country. So imagine in Chicago, if the gangs that we talk about not only were powerful enough that they were more powerful than the police, but they were basically the local government in that neighborhood, right? So every neighborhood has a different government, very unstable. And really, would we even really be a city anymore? We'd just be a collection of small neighborhoods, wouldn't we? On the other hand, you have countries like Canada, Australia, lots of Europe and us, where we're very much more stable, much less strife. In other words, these are areas that are good to invest in. These are areas that are bad to invest in. Another aspect of all of this international movement of money are non-governmental agencies. These are large bodies of different countries that work together. So the United Nations, the UN, is a non-governmental agency. It is a collection of nations. It isn't one nation, it's a collection of nations. Okay? Governments are members. So the United States is part of the UN, but we do not run the UN. Okay? Now there are a couple we're going to talk about that primarily focus on global economy and the idea of free trade. So the first one is the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. And it was originally designed, its purpose was to loan money to countries that were undergoing economic instability. They were having troubles with their job market. And this group, the IMF, would step in and give them basically a small loan, borrow them some cash to help them get back on their feet so that their country wouldn't basically dissolve into a revolution. Okay. Now, who runs the IMF depends in large part on who gives it the money. Anybody can join and be basically a member of the board. Any country can join, I should say. And the money that they loan is given by the countries that join. So the United States actually gives money to the IMF. And what happens is the more money you give, the more votes you get. So the richer countries have a much more powerful role in the IMF. Okay? And one of the criticisms is that in order for the IMF to come help your country, they watch what you do, they watch your policies, and they want policies that favor free trade over any other. And so that might not be in your best interest. Sometimes governments will protect their own industries in their own country from unfair trade from other countries. The IMF doesn't really care. What they want is what works best for them, which tends to be the larger, richer countries. Another example is the World Bank. And the World Bank is just like it sounds. It is a bank made up of several large, wealthy countries that give loans. So if they want to fix the Panama Canal in Panama, they want to build a bigger canal, it's going to cost them $85 billion. They can't pay for that all at once. The money they get from charging tolls on the canal will pay for it, so they need a loan, like a house mortgage. But where do you get a loan if you're a country? You go to the World Bank. And the World Bank will invest in this. And the idea is that the investment they would give Panama to build the canal, they'll get paid back with interest because Panama will pay them back. But the problems with this, very same to the IMF, the countries that fund the World Bank are the richer countries. So the things that they will fund, the investments they make, will always favor the richer country to the end, right? Another criticism is that the World Bank, when they look at developing countries, countries that want a loan, and one country says, we want a loan so that we can build a university to teach our population better job skills. We want to train our own doctors, our own engineers, our own scientists. And another country says, we want to build a big factory to make engines for cars so that our people have jobs and a secure income. Both countries are poor, but the World Bank will favor the country that is going to develop a factory versus developing their own people, because a factory tends to make more money. So they always favor development of the economy over development of people. Last one is the World Trade Organization. And countries who join the World Trade Organization agree that as part of their membership, they will try to eliminate the barriers to trade. They will get rid of the taxes and the laws that make it hard to trade between countries, with the idea being that if trade is open and free, trade will increase. And there is some truth to that countries that are part of the WTO have extremely higher amounts of international trade, which makes money. But as you can see right here underneath me, it doesn't always work that way. One thing about free trade or fair trade is it isn't equitably spread. So this leads us to my last section, this idea of neoliberalism, the reality and promise. And what is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism is this economic theory or political theory. It's kind of both. That if you have a small government, if you have very little laws, low taxes, and you favor free trade, that the open market, the free economy, the competition of the open market will drive innovation and increase productivity, and everybody will do better for it. So in our country, right, how many times have you heard that if you get rid of this regulation, that company can sell more cars? And if they sell more cars, they can pay their workers more money. And their workers will have a better life because they have more money. That's the I promise of neoliberalism. Now, the picture you see here, that's Ronald Reagan, U.S. President, 1980, and Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of England. They were two of the earliest proponents of this theory. And so one of the first things they both did was cut taxes. The idea, if there's less taxes, if companies can make more profit, then they're going to be inspired to make even more profit. Okay. Another aspect of this is things that are normally provided for the public by the government. In order to make the government smaller, we're going to sell them to the private industry. And the private industry, just by its nature of having to make money, is always more competitive. It'll do better. In other words, we're going to run our government like a business, right? So, a great example in Chicago is the parking meter situation. About 10, 15 years ago, the city of Chicago owned all the parking meters, and they paid people to go out and take a look at your car and give you a parking ticket. And that money was used for city funding. But a company called LAZ came in and paid the city of Chicago a couple $1 billion for the parking meters. And what they bought from the city was the right to install parking meters and then collect any tickets that they get and any fees they get. The city gets nothing from the parking meters. Why did they do that? Why did they give up that income? Well, they got upfront a couple $1 billion. And they gave up the right to the parking meter for 75 years. So they basically took cash on front, up ahead. The idea was that LAZ, the parking meter company, would put in more parking meters, make it more efficient, and would run it better. In reality, it hasn't quite worked out that well. A lot of times we see this with schools. The idea of charter schools or private schools. They come in, they say the government can't run the school efficiently, it doesn't work, but a charter school can. And that's the promise. But what is the reality that we'll talk about? It doesn't always match up. But all of this leads to the idea that if you improve corporate profitability, you increase competitiveness. And the desire to compete and be more profitable will drive innovation and make things better. But the reality is this. If you have a belief that favors profitability and tries to increase it, then you also run the risk of having companies try to influence politics by giving them money, because to give money makes money. And so what we actually see in reality, this idea that politics is corrupt because politicians get money from large corporations to vote for them, kind of is the dark side of neoliberalism. And that we actually have seen in neoliberal politics this increase in tariff barriers. And think about Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a neoliberal. But what was his big thing? We're going to make America great, and we're going to make laws that basically favor our industry. Or we're going to tax or put a tariff on all goods from other countries, which at its very heart is technically not what neoliberalism is, but it's what it has become. Okay? That's not to say that everyone accepts this on face value. There are many who say that neoliberalism has been a major damage to things like human rights, environmental protection. One of the things that has happened since Donald Trump has come into office and used neoliberal policies is we've seen a gradual relaxing of the laws that protect our environment, the laws that make it harder for cars to pollute and factories, and reducing that in the name of making these companies more profitable is the backside, increased environmental degradation. The idea right now, one of the biggest things we're talking about with this coronavirus is a lot of people can't take off of work because they don't have paid sick leave. In a neoliberal society, you don't want laws like paid sick leave and health insurance to slow down companies. You want to have companies make as much money as possible because you promise that if companies make more money, they'll pay their workers more money and they can afford to pay for insurance. But the practice is, if you gut the laws that do that, and there's no law to make them help with the health insurance, then you have a situation like now where a large number of people don't have that. So human rights fall by the wayside. And there's many people who campaign against that. In our presidential campaign, That is one of the main things. One of the main issues of contention is how do we fund health insurance? So, as we end this lecture, let's come back to this idea of the flat world, right? The economically flat world. The world is not flat. The flat world means that we have smoothed or made flat economic distances. It costs just as much to make a car in Mexico or Brazil than it does in the United States. It's still physically further, but it doesn't matter in cost. Okay? And this has been accomplished by smoothing out the national economic differences. So in other words, we're not going to tax a car made in Brazil. We're going to make it as if you could sell it here for no cost. And so we're making the world much flatter. But in the reality is that the world is not perfectly economic flat. Some parts are flatter than others. So the world's more economically misshapen, right? There are some areas where there are still barriers to trade. It is still technically not legal to buy things made in Cuba in this country because of laws about that go back to political issues from the 1950s and 60s. So there is definitely an economic mountain there. There is no such law about goods made in Mexico, right? So, but even within our own country, there are some economically inaccessible areas. One of the issues that's coming up right now with everybody doing distance learning is the idea of internet access. In cities like Chicago and New York and Los Angeles, there's a much better internet system. There's stronger internet signals. You can get 5G on your phone. You can get extra high-speed 1 gig wireless on your cable. But if you go out to, say, southern Illinois, outside of Springfield, and you live out in the country, you don't have Wi-Fi. You don't have 5G. And the only cable you get comes from your cable company, and it's not as fast. So you have less access. And generally speaking, the poorer an area of the country is, the less access they have to the internet. And if you think of how much commerce is done on the internet, one of the biggest companies in the world is Amazon, which does almost all their business in connection with the internet. Then they're not really part of the wider economic world. Okay? We also see that in mature capitalist societies like us, especially the US, that producer services, managing the services, so the executives, the lawyers, the people that make the movies, the high end, has become very important in that, and that they are not spread equally around the world. And that this has affected capital and labor in different ways. It's been a bad thing for labor because capital now can move. The flatter the world, the easier it is to move your money and your investments to other countries. Whereas labor, you live where you live. You can't work in Mexico, but work here. You have to be one or the other. And so there's just differing lows. There's differing levels of globalization. Not every part is as globalized as other parts. So thank you very much for listening, for those of you who did listen for this lecture. Again, as always, these chapter summary points are good things to come back to. The PowerPoints are also up so that you don't have to see my face in the corner if you want. But again, thank you much, and we'll see you in chapter 13.